Welcome this afternoon to the Smarter Content, Better Learning session. We've only got about an hour because lunch started late and lunch is sacrosanct, so we will rattle through things. What we'll do is we'll have some presentations, some opening remarks from the gentleman to my left, and then we'll go through to some questions from the floor, and questions which don't contain sales pitches are especially welcome. What we're going to discuss is the changing face of education resources, where technological developments are raising the possibility of a fundamental shift in the way that we provide our schools with educational content, and so change the way that pupils learn. So I want to spend some time looking at how that will affect both developing and developed countries, and how we can find and how we can afford the best content, and how to make it available, and how can we guarantee the platform and the connectivity and the hardware with which to access it, as well as who curates that content and who creates that content. And are the newcomers to the education content world going to usurp the traditional publishers? And with this, to discuss it, we have a stellar panel, including a man who's risen from his deathbed almost this morning with a lesson to always avoid lettuce. So David Coltart, on the far left, is a human rights lawyer of 30 years standing and is currently Zimbabwe's Minister for Education, Sports, Art and Culture, and has been since February 2009, I think. And from the looks of his Twitter feed, he's a cricket obsessive as well. In the middle, we have Matthew Cam, who's a senior research scientist at the American Institute for Research, who has worked particularly on the use of mobile devices in education, not least in the developing world, and looking at mobile tech for women and girls' literacy and use of low-cost phone technology for content delivery. And he was looking at the use of tablets to provide content about 10 years before Apple had the idea of using tablets for content. And to my direct left is Shane Hill, a former teacher and the man who founded the excellent Mathletics, as well as Spelodrome and World Maths Day, some of the most used e-learning sites in the world. And a year in a camper van around Australia has not dimmed his enthusiasm, and he's back with Skoolbo, which, again, he hopes will be one of the world's biggest educational games. And more to the point, it's free. So we'll start in reverse order, which I just introduced. And Shane will do some opening remarks first, and then Matthew, and then David, and then we'll open up to the floor. So Shane, away you go.
Excellent. Just a presentation to begin with. If we can get that up on the screen. Okay. So, as Jimmy said, I just going through my background, I was a teacher for 11 years, and then 10 years ago, I decided, I felt that there was so much more that was possible. And so I took a big plunge and gave up the nice, comfortable job, and went sort of beavered away in my garage. And in many ways, got very, very lucky. Probably hit upon some things that came about at just the right time. So launched a program which was called Mathletics, and now we were absolutely ecstatic when children answered 1 million questions on the site. After about a month, that was the case. These days, it's sitting at about 16.5 billion questions. Math questions have been answered on the site, and that still just blows me away. It's quite a big program in terms of covering all concepts from basic kindergarten through to calculus, but then it also had a little component to it, which was a game, and so a mental arithmetic numeracy game. Now, as a teacher, I have to say I wasn't overly proud of that part. That was sort of a bit of a gimmick. I was incredibly proud of all of the other components to the e-learning. But what I very quickly saw was that the children responded incredibly well to the game, and they found the other parts boring. And when you analyse the data, it was the game component that I would argue has led to 90% of the benefit from the program. So in 2006, we expanded into a spelling-based program. In 2007, we hit upon a concept called World Math Day. It actually was timed with Pi Day, which was a couple of days back. And now, these days, some 5 million children take part in that, and over the course of 48 hours they answer about 500 million questions. So again, pretty mind-blowing figures. For the last 3 years, we've been developing another program which is all about early reading and numeracy, particularly targeted at 4 to 7-year-olds is our main target range. We've gone some pretty high-end graphics because there's different. I mean, the biggest thing is engaging the children, and so it depends where you're trying to work. But if we look at developed countries, the competition for the children's time, of course, is straight video games, and so we have a high benchmark as to what we've got to go up against. The needs, of course, in a country such as South Sudan and so on would be quite different, and so my belief on this one is that you have to meet the technology needs in the environment that you're competing with the children's time for. Now, just a couple of other things in terms of on the topic. In a way, a lot of the discussion here has been what I would consider two quite distinctly different parts of education. One of them is pre-literacy. And by literacy, we would define that in its broadest context in terms of learning to read, basic mathematics, basic spoken English or another language if that is important and a life-changing activity for you to have, basic health and hygiene. So those core essentials. Then, of course, it moves beyond that, because if you say, well, is that enough for children in today's society? Well, no, it's not enough. Of course, we want to take them far further. But I certainly believe that it's a truism that if the children don't attain the basic literacies, of course, everything else then falls apart. In terms of some of the statistics around, we've seen the literacy figures that are put forward here. I would actually contend that they're worse. I mean, they're shocking, but they're worse in the sense that UNESCO defines literacy as someone who can read and write one simple sentence about themselves. So if I can write the sentence, I am a cook, and read it, then I am deemed literate. Now, I don't think there's anyone in the room here that would say that's a sufficient definition of literacy. For the last 20 or so years, there's been the adult literacy and skills surveys that came out of the Canadian Bureau of Statistics. And sort of every 5 years or so, a group of 10 or more countries are extensively surveyed in terms of the adult literacy rates in their society. And they put them into bands rather than just a simple yes or no. And it's simply from very low through to high. They deem that a moderate level is the minimum needed in a society. Roughly speaking, that equates to a 4th grade level of literacy. If you look at a developed country such as the United States, 52% of the population don't make that level. Now to me, that's a crime. It's a crime that we're not speaking more about it, that it is a major issue. And these figures have been repeated sort of in survey after survey. In terms of best countries in the world, a country like Norway, about 30% of the population have not been hitting that sort of what is deemed a minimum standard. So in my view, that's sort of the biggest issue in education. Now, in terms of if you want to put a financial cost to it, well, the World Literacy Foundation puts it at, in the United States alone, at costing them at $301 billion per annum in a straight financial cost. They estimate across the world 1.2 trillion in that literacy is costing us. Of course, if we look socially, there's many more ones. Whether we want to say that sort of a child is 50% more likely to make it past 5 if their mother is literate. Of course, a study out of India said that came through last year said that a child has a 35% chance of living beyond 1 month if their mother isn't literate. So the social costs are horrendous, but of course the financial costs are huge as well. So my beliefs, I feel that radical improvement is possible, not just minor. In terms of technology, I'm not talking about 5 or 10% improvement in outcomes. Say on that game, if I go back to the live mathletics, what we saw in basic numeracy in the space of 2 hours on task time at improving a core basic numeracy, we saw 130% improvement of 2 hours task time, repeated over millions of students. So radical improvement is highly possible. I do believe that literacy is solvable. I believe we know how to do it already. I don't see this as a technical issue at all. It's a human issue. It's a political issue. And so in terms of great software and hardware, I mean, this is a discussion about software. Yes, software is very important. Great hardware without good software is useless. But equally, great software with non-robust hardware is, again, useless. But those two combined still don't make it. It's the people that, and the systems, the entire ecosystem. For the developing countries, of course, it's power. It's a huge, huge issue. Connectivity is a big issue in this area. Now, connectivity is coming, but in my view, not coming quickly enough. So therefore, we have to jump that and take that out of the equation. Okay, so some recent game changes that make me highly optimistic in terms of what's happening. To me, the biggest thing in the last 5 years is the advent of the tablet. And the reason for that being so powerful is that it makes everything accessible for the very young. Literacy needs to be solved when children are young. In America, the studies show that if you're a struggling reader at the end of first grade, you're 88% likely to be struggling at the end of fourth grade. At the end of fourth grade, it's pretty much certain that it's lifelong. So therefore, you must solve it early. Now, pre-tablets, e-learning wasn't accessible to 4, 5 and 6-year-olds. It was a nightmare to take a class of kindergarten children into a computer lab. A teacher's total worst nightmare. But tablets, on the other hand, make that completely possible. A child that's never been exposed to technology before if the software is intuitive, can pick it up in sort of a matter of minutes. Again, for the developing countries, of course, if the children or the adults haven't been exposed to technology, again, the learning curve is so shallow on tablets that it makes it possible. Phone penetration is a big one. I personally view that the limitations on the screen size as being sort of a real issue. I'm more a supporter of a tablet rather than a phone solution. But of course, the phone penetration rates are very sizable, and so if they've got that resource, then we must make best use of it. But in terms of cost and so on, low-cost tablets are now successful at the $50 range, and what's happening in India with the Akash and so on, trying to get it at the $25 one is clearly irrelevant. The increased connectivity, I said, decreasing hardware costs, maturing of e-learning. We know what works. It's proven. The data is there. The key is the proof. But cloud-based services have again radically changed business models, but that's only relevant in the connected world. Solar power technology, very, very important. Definitely getting better. We need to get better still, so that the remote tablets are able to function well. I mean, there's no point putting a tablet out there if the total cost of ownership is impossible. Even if they have electricity, if the cost of the electricity is so great that it then means that it's not going to be used, of course it's a useless solution. So we must solve the power part. Okay, what works? Well, what I found works is certainly make it fun. Now that's particularly in a developed country where the competitive forces on the children's time. So the challenge is in countries such as the United States to engage the disengaged, and there are so many disengaged. The help adults say, wow. the photograph that I've put down there is Sugata Mitra. You may know him or know of him in terms of Hole in the Wall. He, a couple of weeks back, was recognised with the TED Prize for 2013. So he's done amazing things in India. One of the things that struck me by his TED Talk acceptance speech was sort of when he was asked, well, what's the biggest thing that to work, is say wow, the granny effect, as he called it. You don't necessarily, his argument is you don't need a teacher at times. He's trying to solve it without a teacher, but what you do need is an advocate, a parent or grandparent that just says, fantastic, wow, I couldn't have done that when I was a child. And that's often what spurs the children on best. Fast-paced was something we've really found. If you want to teach a child to add to 10, put them under the clock. Give them 60 seconds to answer as many questions as they can. It'll work so much better than letting them take a limitless amount of time. Opportunities to fail. One of the most important. As parents and schools, of course, one of the best things that we can do is give them the chance to fail. Learn by doing. I'm more a supporter of get them doing rather than watching, and the trial and error approach. Remove limitations. It's one of the biggest issues in terms of the limitations that us as parents and teachers place on the children. We so often are guilty of thinking that the children can't do that, when the fact is that they can. They constantly surprise us. If in your solution it provides opportunities for the children to surprise you, then they will. Okay. Well, these are overall questions, but I'll jump through that because I know I'm short of time. Today, we've been afforded the opportunity to announce something special as well by the organisers, which we have a major event coming up in September. We've partnered with Peace One Day, who you may know of. It's an organisation that really promotes International Day of Peace. They've had tremendous impact, such as they've worked with the Taliban to obtain ceasefires so that children could be immunised for polio. And it's estimated that 4.5 million children have been immunised as a consequence of it. So we're and our other partners, Microsoft, in September, we're doing a major sort of global event over the internet called Friend Our World. I'll just play a very brief video on it, so you can see all about it.
Together we stand, together as one. Different faces, different tongues. We are the children of this earth. Give us the voice that we deserve. We can't stop fighting if we try to understand. 不要再抢有和平世界。We are the future and the future's in our hands. Be love, be love. It's us, it's in our hands, in our hands. 不要害怕，牵我的手。Amale tu amujhe chal saath chale. Tu dost tera, main dost teri, chal sang bade. Amale tu amujhe chal saath chale. Tu dost tera, main dost teri, chal sang bade.
Just in terms of that song, we think it's something of a world first. You may have picked it. There's 7 languages in that one. I encourage any of you connected with schools and so on to try to mobilise the forces. It's fully multilingual. It'll be in some 50 languages we are sort of doing for September. So thank you.
Thank you, Shane. And again, the cricket fans amongst you will realise what a rarity that was, an Australian with a PowerPoint. That doesn't happen very often, I'm led to believe. Straight on to Matthew. I think Matthew's got a presentation as well.
Testing. Can you guys hear me loud and clear? Yeah, I need my I'm just testing the volume. Can you guys in the audience hear me loud and clear? Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so unlike Shane, I don't have anything to announce. So I have been asked by the organizers to come up with an idea for the use of technology for workforce development. And this idea that I have is called on-the-job electronic coaches. But before I talk about that, I thought I would just share with you 2 slides about the background of the organization that I work for. That's called the American Institutes for Research. I'll also talk a bit about previous research that I've done on the use of low-cost cell phones for promoting literacy in developing countries before I talk about electronic coaches. Okay, so essentially, the American Institutes for Research is an organization that I'm proud to work with because in all the research that we do, there's always this focus on trying to improve lives for the disadvantaged populations. So I think that's what actually drives me. And so for example, you guys would know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has been funding several education improvement programs in the US. And when they need somebody to conduct a rigorous third-party evaluation, well, they come to us to do that kind of external evaluations for them. Similarly, another strength that the American Institutes for Research, ARR, has is on conducting state-level and national-level online assessments. So that's something that we partnered with Google to actually conduct on the Google Chrome laptop. And recently we got an award from the US Department for scaling this work further. That was pretty fortunate in the sense that there were very strong competitors going for the same solicitation as us, including Pearson. But we were able to put up a proposal that was competitive, not only in terms of quality, but also in terms of price. So this is just a, let me just move. Okay, yeah. So besides this, well, I thought I'll also talk a bit about some of these education projects that we do. So you can read this for yourself. So in addition to getting funding from foundations and corporations, well, we get the bulk of our funding from government agencies like the US Agency for International Development. But at the same time, we want to be at the vanguard of this transformation, this transition from a development aid model into a development-centric model instead. And one way to do that is really to emphasize the importance of research. So, for example, one of the things that I'm coordinating at ARR is on this partnership with a regional organization that has 34 member countries. And these 34 member countries will go to this organization every now and then for various kinds of assistance, technical cooperation. So basically, they might come with questions like, well, if we need to design a literacy learning initiative in our country, what is the best way to design that? Or for example, if we need to design an educational technology project, for example, how do we even think through what that should actually involve? And these are actually very difficult questions because if you really want to do it right, resources are scarce. And if we want to make the best use of resources, we need to actually take into account all the research and all the lessons that we have actually learned about that so that we make sure that we actually maximize the impact. We actually stretch the use of all these limited resources that we have when we design and implement a project. So that's a kind of technical cooperation that we are providing to this regional organization using research to actually help their member countries deliver the maximum bang for the buck, so to speak. Okay, so the Director General for UNESCO has said this. You know, we have very interesting programs on how to train teachers through mobile technologies, and with smartphones, literacy classes can be provided. So that's great, and that was actually why UNESCO commissioned me to write a case study for them on mobile phones for literacy learning, because I've been doing research on this area since 2004. But we don't actually need to be waiting for smartphones in order to do that. And I think that's one of the points that I want to emphasize, because smartphones are expensive. You know, when you talk about smartphones, we are talking about the iPhone, we are talking about Android phones. Yeah, and they are not cheap. Yeah, so for example, we will be looking for phones that would be $80 or even more than $450 per piece. And right now, there's about 1.1 billion of these phones out there, but most of them are actually in industrialized countries. So one of those opportunities that I think people haven't thought enough about, and I encourage you guys in the audience to actually consider, would be the use of the feature phone instead. You know, the phones in the middle category that are actually programmable. So these are lower end phones that we can actually develop interactive educational software for. And we should actually be trying to take advantage of the hardware that is most prevalent today. But more important than that, there's also basic phones, which is still used by a lot of people in developing countries. And as they start to upgrade to a better phone, they would actually be upgrading to feature phones as opposed to smartphones. So this is why I strongly encourage people to think about the value of feature phones. And that's actually what we have been doing in our research project so far. So in our research project, there was actually research that I did before I joined the American Institutes for Research. So I did this work on mobiles for literacy in developing countries, mostly in India, a little in China. That was actually done when I was at the University of California, Berkeley, and later when I was a professor at Carnegie Mellon. So with a group of students, we were fortunate in getting this research done. He has been featured on television and in the press, and also in lots of academic publications that you guys can actually search for online, or you can Google me to ask for those publications. The more important thing is that, well, we've been doing this work since 2004, so I'm just going to compress some of the key results into 2 slides, okay? But I think the more important thing is really to recognize that when we use technology, well, cell phone technology for literacy, the focus of my work has been on English as a second language so far in India. But you can take the same basic idea and apply that to other subjects like math or science. You can apply that to native language literacy. You can also apply that to adult learners. So it's basically generalizable. But in our work, we are focused on ESL because there's importance in India. And we have looked at the use of mobiles in very different environments, not only in after-school programs, but also in some of these environments like everyday homes, because, well, sometimes kids just don't have opportunities to go to school, or they might be able to go to school, but they can't spend that much time in school, or schools get disrupted. So how do we actually use mobile technology that they actually have at home to make learning more accessible to them outside school, okay, when schools are scarce or not fully functional? At the same time, well, for this conference, we have been talking a lot about low-fee private schools, and so we have also done a pilot in 4 of these schools that charge monthly school fees between $2 a month to slightly less than $7 a month. So we've seen that whole spectrum. And again, that is really to look at ways where technology can actually help training providers to differentiate themselves from their competitors and to provide better quality of learning. Okay, so this is just me in one slide trying to summarize some of the learning improvements that we have seen. So, you know, the theme of this panel is on smarter content, better learning. And in terms of better learning, well, I think one thing that we have found was really this thing that according to the research on reading literacy, so in order to be a skilled reader, well, ideally a child should actually be acquiring 500 new words, so 500 vocabulary words per year. If that child is actually learning in a very, very ideal situation with very good infrastructure, very highly trained teachers. So we are talking about first world conditions. But in our pilots, we have seen that the kids in our pilots, well, if you take the data and extrapolate that over one entire year, well, of course, they can't learn 500 words, but they could cover slightly less than 1/3 of that requirements just in out-of-school learning environments. So that doesn't count how much they can be learning at the same time in a regular school environment. So this itself would be a level of learning, 1/3 of this vocabulary requirements that they otherwise wouldn't actually be getting access to if they were not participating in this mobile learning program. Okay, but I think what I really want to talk about is how do we actually get some of these learning results? Okay, and that's where it's important to think about how do you actually do the content. And to me, it's not really so much about content that is smarter. It's more about us approaching content development and content design in a smarter way. Okay, so for example, like Shane, I work on educational games because that makes the learning experience fun. But when we first tried to do educational games in the villages in India, that was so difficult because the children in the villages in India were not familiar with the kinds of Western video games that all of us grew up playing. You know, and the thing was that we grew up playing those games, and that was why we were so stuck in our mindset about what constitutes a video game. But those games were not making sense to village children. So we were actually forced to take a step back. We studied 28 of their traditional village games, and then afterwards, we actually analyzed what were the elements that make up their traditional village games. We also did a cross-cultural analysis of what were the differences between their traditional games and the kinds of contemporary Western video games like Warcraft that we play, so that I was actually able to get a list of about 75 different differences between these two families of games. And those differences eventually formed this set of design guidelines for our video game design process that helped us to actually design culturally appropriate games. So I just use this as an example to help you understand that, and I'm sure people in the audience also appreciate this fact that when we talk about doing educational technology or even regular textbook content, there's really a lot of difference between using content for middle-income urban children in a developing country as opposed to children in a village. There really is a big gap, and we need to be very sensitive to all these kinds of differences if we really want to make an impact. Okay, so this is where I'll just share briefly this idea that I've been asked to think about and to share. So this is this idea called just on-the-job electronic coaches. And in order to set the stage, maybe I'll just ask, how many of you guys in this audience use Microsoft Word or Excel or PowerPoints for your work? Oh, great, yeah. And I was expecting this answer, by the way, okay? Because, you know, one of the things that we might not appreciate, but if I point this out, it becomes obvious that as we try to look into ways where we can actually move up the value chain to get better paying jobs, well, most of these jobs actually require the use of information technology, and we need to be fluent in the use of Microsoft Word or Excel or PowerPoint in order to carry out these kinds of tasks. But unfortunately, there really is a bit of this disconnect between pre-employment training or K-12 training or college education, and when we actually, as a knowledge-based worker, have to be sitting in front of a computer to actually crank out work using a computer. Okay, because when we are in front of a computer and we have to get the work done, we might not exactly remember what we learned during the pre-employment training, or we might not exactly understand that well enough to apply that on our own when there isn't a coach around. So that really is the idea behind this coach idea. How many of you guys use spell checking features in Microsoft Word? Okay, great. And again, you know, I was using this just as a quick example to help you see that, well, spell checkers in Microsoft Word would be an example of a kind of a coach that helps the user to perform and produce high quality work with perfect spelling. Okay, so that's one of those kinds of things. But we can actually think way beyond just spelling, right? So for example, you know, the basic idea that I'm really trying to share here is that, well, on-the-job learning is important. And it's very important that people, well, especially people who are not fully trained, but you need them to be hired and to be performing work, because otherwise companies would always never be able to find fully trained and skilled workers. So if you get somebody who's partially trained, put him in front of a computer that actually has an electronic coach that helps him to get the rest of his work done, well, that's one way to actually alleviate this labor shortage challenge. And I won't go too much into this other than to point out that you guys can look at this website if you want to when you have time. It's called onetonline.org. It's a project that's been done by several organizations, including the American Institutes for Research, funded by the US Department of Labor. But this is an example of how when we talk about workplace development, well, we actually do an analysis, you know, in terms of cognitive abilities, physical abilities, the skills, technological knowledge, blah, 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 that's required for various occupations. And then Well, I did a search on this database, okay, to find out how many occupations actually require the knowledge of Microsoft Word, for example. And it actually turned out that there's more than 500 hits, okay, as you can see from this website. Here's another example of, well, when we actually zoom into one of these occupations to get a list of all the different kinds of workforce skills that's actually needed for somebody to carry this out, to carry out the job in this occupation well. Okay, so I mentioned that just as a way of showing that, if we are talking about coaches, for example, well, one example that I would just use to explain that would be this example of resume writing, because all of us understand this. Okay, I had to find an example that everybody here is going to understand. So I picked this example of resume writing, because if you look at how somebody who's not well trained writes a resume, he needs a lot of help. And work training centers in some places I've been to actually do this kind of work, right? So how good it would be if you actually have a user in front of a computer who's trying to write his resume, and he gets feedback from a word processor like Microsoft Word telling him that, well, you're not consistent in the use of your language, you are not using active verbs when you're writing about your accomplishments, you're not using bullet points, you're using too long sentences and all those things. So that's an example of how a kind of electronic coach can actually be built into a word processor, so that we could actually provide the person who's sitting in front of it with the just-in-time kind of assistance and training to actually produce high-quality work. And if somebody were to ask me, how would I actually get this thing done? Well, so this would be the process that I would actually suggest. And it all really starts with going into the workplace to get a sense of the kinds of errors, the kind of problems that somebody who's trying to perform the work, who has obtained some level of pre-employment training would be facing, so that we actually understand what are those kinds of challenges in delivering the work that we could actually build into the technology. So, well, the advantage of this approach is that, we focus a lot on the training and assistance right exactly at a point where the new employee actually needs most assistance on. So what's really scalable about this approach is that, it doesn't just allow employers to actually get high quality work done by people who might not have all the necessary pre-employment training. It's not just about reducing training costs, but what's really, I think, worth thinking about this idea is that this is scalable. Okay, scalable in the sense that if you look at all these workplaces that's coming up in various emerging economies, well, they have computers equipped with all these word processor software, spreadsheets, internet browsers, and well, all these kind of electronic coaches can actually be built as extensions that you can basically install as an extended feature onto Word and all that. So it's a highly scalable model that you can distribute. So with that, I'll just stop here and provide you guys with my email address, which is mkam@arr.org. So please email me if you would like a copy of the slides, or leave me a copy of your business card later. And for the mobile games that I talked about, I'm also happy to give a demo later to anybody who comes up. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. And moving swiftly on, nothing more from me, straight to David.
Good afternoon, everyone. We moved from the academic and the theoretical to the practical. I'm a lawyer, I'm not an educationalist, and I make no pretensions about being one. As I was introduced, I'm the Minister of Education from Zimbabwe, and I'm sure that when I mention that word Zimbabwe, it immediately conjures up in your mind a picture of political disturbances and chaos, and that certainly has been the situation in the country for the last 15 years. And of course, political turmoil in any country impacts the education system of a country, and impacts, of course, the amount of money that one can spend on technology in any country. Last year, to put it in context, for non-salary expenditure, I had available to me 39 cents per child for the whole year. So you'll appreciate that our means of introducing technology in that context is exceptionally limited. If we look at Zimbabwe's education system, we find it's a very curious mix, because on the one hand, it is afflicted by the lack of funding. It is dilapidated and antiquated. For example, the curriculum was last reviewed comprehensively way back in 1986. It has suffered from 2 decades of serious underfunding. The physical infrastructure of schools are crumbling. There are very few computers in schools at all. Not even heads or teachers have access to computers. And even if computers are available, 70% of schools are in rural areas. There is exceptionally limited connectivity, and most schools don't even have access to a reliable source of power. That's the bleak side of it, but there's another side to the story. Against that bleak picture, Zimbabwe remarkably still has, in African terms certainly, a very high standard of education. Whilst I hear Shane's reservations about UNDP figures, and I share those reservations about the method of determining literacy, nevertheless, the UNDP a couple of years ago found that Zimbabwe had the highest literacy rate in Africa. And even if one questioned those figures, the fact is that we do still have, despite this chaos, very high literacy rates. Our local examination authority produces, to this day, a standard of examinations at the end of secondary school, that is children turning 16, and then they go on to A-levels for children turning 18, higher than Cambridge. Our graduates are sought after by South African, Australian, American universities. And so it is a very curious mix. We still achieve this in the context of economic chaos and a lack of access to modern technology. And at the very least, it illustrates that technology is not necessarily a panacea. And as we move forward, as I seek to stabilize the education sector and transform it, I constantly have that in the back of my mind. I've been minister in Zimbabwe for the last 4 years as part of an inclusive government which was designed to stabilize the country. And when I took over 4 years ago, I found the education sector in a state of almost total collapse. 8,000 schools closed, 90,000 teachers on strike. The textbook pupil ratio was 15 children on average to one textbook. And as I spoke about just now, hardly any access to computers and exceptionally limited funding. So my primary focus in the last 4 years has been to stabilize the sector, to get basic learning materials, not computer-based learning materials. What we did is we hauled out some of the textbooks some of which had been written 20 years ago, and with UNICEF produced those textbooks, produced some 23 million textbooks, core textbooks, and delivered them to children, and got the pupil textbook ratio in those core subject areas down to 1-to-1. We're now moving on to readers, and a key focus of our strategy is to look at mother tongue education. We've expanded our education curriculum in the last 4 years to deal with all the different indigenous languages. But our primary focus has been on restoring standards to basic literacy and numeracy. Having stabilized over the last 4 years, we're still in a state of crisis, but we are now in a position to start moving ahead to try and use technology better. I'm deeply conscious of the fact that one can waste a lot of money on technology. Just south of us in South Africa, there was a very ambitious program in Gauteng, around Johannesburg in South Africa, to ensure that every child had access to a laptop. It has been a total disaster. One of the reasons for that was because the computers were delivered without the necessary training, and teachers in particular were not trained up in the use of those computers. And so a key element of our policy has been to focus more on teachers than on children as we roll out an education technology strategy. So what are our strategies? I'm conscious that we've run out of time, so I'm going to just speak very briefly. We have the following rollout. Firstly, we recognize that we need to review and reform our curriculum. And in that reformation process, we need to incorporate ICT in the teaching of all subjects. And the one benefit that we have is that we can leapfrog technologies and also benefit from the trial and error that other countries have had to go through. Secondly, we are deeply conscious of the need not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We clearly are strong in literacy and numeracy teaching using these old technologies. And it is very important that as we embrace technology, that we don't use some of those traditional methods of education. Thirdly, we are developing a central hub in the capital, Harare, to develop educational applications. 20 years ago, Zimbabwe had one of the most advanced education systems in Africa. It has an entire bank of analog-based technology, learning materials that we want to use and convert into digital format. As we roll out into the schools, we recognize we simply don't have the money to roll out a system of laptops for children and access by individual children to computers themselves. Even cell phone technology is limited because the vast majority of children in rural areas simply are too poor to own even the bottom level cell phone. And so we've decided to pursue tablet technology, and we've been working closely with Apple in the last couple of years. You may ask why Apple. It's expensive, it's upper end, but you'll appreciate that when you have 70% of schools in rural areas and they have a lack of access to technicians and the like, the most important ingredient that we're looking for in a tablet is that it must be robust. So we've worked with Apple in the concept called a school in a box. It comprises of a tablet, of a solar power generator, and of a very powerful projector. Tied into that is the development of our own educational applications, developed at a central location in the capital, loaded onto tablets during school holidays, and then those tablets are sent out to rural schools for use by teachers initially as teaching aids. Our long-term strategy, obviously, is to move more into cell phone technology and ideally cheaper tablets. But this is what we feel that we can achieve. Let me end on this note, that a key element of this rollout is the training of teachers. The teachers understand how to use those tablets and computers in general. So, in conclusion, you will see that whilst I admire the work that is done elsewhere, when it comes to a practical rollout in your poorest developing countries, there's still a lot of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Providing a school in a box on 39 cents per pupil is quite an extraordinary achievement, and that's fantastic. What I want to do is, overrun slightly, despite to the irritation of the organisers, I'm sure, but I think if we cut into our tea and coffee networking schedule, we'll be able to ask the panel a few more questions. So if you do have a question, I think there's guys running around with a microphone. There's a table full of them down here. If you can get to the front. What we'll do is we'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then go around the room again. So, if you want to say who you are first, and then ask the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I want to, first of all, appreciate the discussions put forward by all the speakers. And my question goes to Dr. Matthew regarding the use of cell phones. I come from Cameroon, and Cameroon is a country in sub-Saharan Africa. And my experience has been that in most of the schools in sub-Saharan Africa, the use of cell phones are bound. Cell phones are bound from children taking them to school. So I want to find out if he has any experience. This same question goes to the Honorable Minister from Zimbabwe. What are some of the policies they have put in place regarding the use of cell phones in schools? I want to learn from your experiences. Thank you very much.
Okay, another couple of questions? Sprint round to the front.
Hi, my name is Tahir Munshi. I'm a South African student at Jumeirah College here in Dubai. My question is to Senator Coltart. What do you think are the steps that reforming systems in education, specifically, what steps can they take to ensure that the process of reform is transparent and there's sort of accountability in the system, specifically when they're moving towards decentralized political institutions from previously entrenched centralized institutions like in South Africa? Thank you.
It's kind of a content question, but we'll take it anyway.
I'm also a student from Jumeirah College, and my question's based on the method of learning. I'm from India, and what I've seen is that we integrate games to really get students motivated, as Mr. Hill and Mr. Cam showed. But I'd like to say that even to the Senator, that in areas, in developing countries where students value education so much, is it efficient to still use methods like games and interactive features when students would be complacent with more basic methods of learning?
So what I got from that is one for Shane on is gamification necessary to incentivize pupils, one for Matthew on how schools can reform their policies around cell phones, and one for Senator Coltart on transparency and accountability in school reform. So away we go. I think we'll start with you, Shane.
Excellent question. Look, I have no interest in games in that sense. It's all about education, so it's whatever works as far as I'm concerned. For the children in America and so on, yes, the games are important. For children in India, it may be less so. But in terms of efficient learning, I think one of our goals is that the children, on average, per hour, answer some 600 questions. So that's highly efficient learning. If you go back to a workbook type approach, often they may answer sort of 30 or 40. So it's many, many more times more efficient. But there are a lot of games out there, and I believe they get it wrong, where they may actually have one question every 5 minutes or so, and I think there the criticism is most valid.
Does gamification work with certain kinds of subjects and not others? I mean, it's easier, you can understand how it works in mathematics, less so in history. So can you gamify analytical subjects?
Basic skills are the best, things that are short, sharp, and objective. The interesting thing that we found with Skoolbo, because we brought literacy to it, the question was, would it work as well with literacy as with numeracy? And I didn't think it would, but I still felt that it would work. What we're finding, the literacy improvements are substantially greater than the numeracy improvements, which I was most pleased with. But in terms of higher order thinking skills and so on, not our sorts of games. I mean, we're designed for questions that can be answered in certainly less than 20 seconds of thought time.
Okay. Matthew, I'm assuming that you would see a role for cell phones in school education, but what do schools need to do to make it possible?
Okay, well, that was a great question because that has been the source of my frustration throughout that 1 year when I was doing that 1 year long pilot, trying to get the use of cell phones adopted within the 4 different low-fee private schools that we worked with. So yeah, in terms of policies, well, that's actually important. And I would actually say that that is more important than the hardware and the software. Okay, and when I say policy, it doesn't have to be a government level policy, but it has to be a school policy that supports effective integration of technology into the curriculum so that the technology is not only used frequently, but also used, used wisely. Okay, so first, obviously, we have to convince educators not to ban the use of cell phones in schools. Well, for us, we were actually lucky because the phones that we actually use, they don't come with SIM cards. Okay, so our phones don't require connectivity, so that's great because students can actually use them to make phone calls and do all that kind of distracting stuff. Basically, we are using the phones as very low-end computers that can run the educational games that we have designed. Yeah, but in terms of trying to do some of these basic level reforms, well, the most fundamental thing is that you need to actually convince schools to set aside enough time during the everyday school timetable for kids to actually be using the technology. Otherwise, we are spending so much money on either buying hardware or software, and people are actually underusing the technology. Okay, so we actually have to work with school managements to set aside, scrutinize their timetable and really work with them to carve out time in this timetable so that the kids actually have access to the technology. And for that reason, I'm mostly not a fan of using scarce resources to buy hardware. It's better to actually use hardware that children or their parents already have so that we can focus on content, curriculum development, again, setting educational standards, yeah, that sort of things.
Sorry to interrupt. Is there an element of, I'll spend half my time with my kids telling them to put down that gadget and then just as much time telling them to pick up that gadget? Is there an element to almost parental policy and parental engagement processes to get
Okay,
that as well?
oh, yeah, that was something that I found in another one of my research study. Yes, that was actually another challenge, you see. So again, the kind of policies and challenges vary very differently depending on whether you're trying to use technology in the school or technology in the homes. Well, and we know that there's a lot of logistical barrier to actually increasing the school day. So, and also there's a lot of barriers in trying to convince educators to actually integrate technology into classrooms. So usually, if you look at the history of educational technology has tended to be more easily adopted outside the school. Yeah, but then you run into all kinds of challenges in the homes. For example, when we worked with trying to get 2 villages of children, about 20 of them, to actually use our content on the phones that we loaned them for 1 entire semester. Well, that was actually great on the whole. We got pretty good results. But the benefits of the technology were going disproportionately more to the boys than the girls. Okay, because parents, well, at least in rural India, they tend to think that most of the resources should go to their boys. Okay, and so this kind of mindset also unconsciously affected how they viewed the cell phone, which is a very scarce resource, and how they felt that more time with the technology should actually go to the boys and not the girls. So that, of course, leads us to all these important things like if you're trying to do a mobile learning program, for example, you need to also have accompanying programs on gender sensitization, for example. Otherwise, mobile learning by itself doesn't work. And then, okay, there were some questions about, what are games for? And do you really need to use games? So again, being the cost-conscious engineer, I would say that, ideally, I don't want to actually have to develop games because games are very expensive to produce. I would love to actually make content that's more cost-effective to create. But with the kids that we were working with, unfortunately, games have to be the approach. With adults, well, it tends to be different because adults tend to be motivated by learning when they see that it is connected with employability skills and higher income. And also, I think when we talk about games and the efficiency of games, we need to actually look at it as a psychologist and start asking what exactly are the sub-skills that we are actually trying to have the learners learn. So all this needs to be connected back with the national standards for education. So when we talk about literacy, for example, Well, games are great in some ways. I mean, sure, students are spending a lot of time playing the game, okay? But that's not necessarily a bad thing if they're getting a lot of repeated exposure, a lot of repeated practice. Games are good at encouraging learners to actually replay the games again and again if you design the game well, okay? And a lot of that repeated practice is great for helping learners to develop that kind of automaticity so that you can perform some tasks fluently and unconsciously, you know, so that it becomes a part of you, so that you can focus on some higher order thinking skills, for example. Okay,
Matthew, I'm going to cut across you so I can get David in to answer.
Okay.
And you need to get to David's time again. David, it's about transparency and accountability and reform.
Thanks, Jimmy. But I do think that there was a specific question from our Cameroon friend there as well. So could I just briefly talk about cell phone technology in an African context? Most children in Zimbabwe, an overwhelming majority of children in Zimbabwe did not have cell phones. So at this juncture, it's not an appropriate technology that we can use. However, we are hoping to use cell phone technology in the rollout of our education management information system. We haven't had an electronic system, believe it or not, for data gathering in the education system since 2006. We've got limited funding. We're focusing on computers at head office, provincial and district level, but we see us needing to use cell phone technology at school level for the 8,500 schools. There is a growing connectivity and spread of cell phone companies, so we see that being a very important technology. But using children or using cell phones to teach children, I think is some way off. The other question from regarding the curriculum reform process, and the question was, I think, how do you make that more transparent? It's a very interesting question. It's somewhat of a diversion from our topic this afternoon. But you'll appreciate that in a country where there's been so much political turmoil, when one seeks to introduce technology that spreads information, that can be seen as a threat. And if you seek to reform a curriculum and perhaps have another look at history, that is also seen as a threat to those who want to preserve the status quo. And we've come across a lot of opposition. What we're trying to do is to make the process as inclusive as possible, to draw in all sectors of society. And of course, this is where technology does come in terms of transforming not just an educational system, but an entire country, and trying to democratize it. Because technology makes information so much more readily accessible to the general public, to children, and of course to the curriculum development process. In the brief time, I don't know if that helps you.
Thank you. We've got another quick round of questions before we break off for coffees. Anybody else want to ask some? Gentleman down here? Where's the microphone gone? Oh, you got it already. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Art Jones, and I'm the director with Dream Factory, an educational production company out of Washington, D.C. And originally I had a question for you, Matthew, because what attracted me to this particular session was technology and education. But having worked in the field myself and ran an institute in technology in Washington, D.C. for teachers, one key component came to my attention, and that is one that we had been kind of leaving out of the conversation. And I learned this back in 1994, and I'm not hearing this in this conversation here, and that is the role that parents and or significant others in a child's life play in the development of your technology program. And I'm really directing this less to Matthew than to the Minister of Education from Zimbabwe.
Okay, thank you. If you could pass the microphone just in front of you, and we'll go through those again.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'm Rayan Kudu from Myanmar, the economic city. We know that technology evolved from learning about ICT to the learning with ICT to learning through ICT. And we see that the integration between the digital and the educational component or the curriculum is quite slow. I think the question is, what could we do more from a technology perspective or from educationalist perspective to accelerate that that momentum and integration. And the second question is that in traditional systems, I see ICT as an add-on in terms of cost, not in terms of a cost reducer in a certain way. So it's always an add-on. I think there we should reach a tipping point where it becomes a cost or a value driver and a value engineering tool instead of a value addition. So I would like to get your perspectives on that.
Okay. And one more question. Again, the gentleman at the front, it's probably easy to just pass the microphone over if you can.
My name is Brahma Jame from the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education in Gambia. I have a question for Shem and Dr. Matthew. Maybe first with Dr. Matthew. How did you use, or what was your experience in using mobile phone in teacher training program? Maybe to Shem, you've talked about using technology in teaching literacy and numeracy. Who was or who is responsible for developing the curriculum of that particular content? Because, like, for example, you go to countries, you have national curriculum, and here are developers of technology. So how did you manage, or how did you organize the curriculum development and the digitalizing, this particular curricula vis-a-vis the technology and the national curriculum? How do you manage those things? These are my questions.
Okay, gentlemen, I think you can cherry pick what you like out of that lot. There's, I've got the role of parents in driving technology. How do you accelerate the adoption of technology so that technology becomes invisible in the classroom and on the accounting sheet? And how you use mobiles more widely in the classroom, and how you adapt content to curriculum. So we'll start from the far left and work inwards this time.
Okay, first of all, parents. One of the strengths of the Zimbabwean education system is the role of parents. In fact, if one does a comparative study between Zimbabwe's education system and South Africa's education system, you can see the impact that it has, because the apartheid era policies in South Africa were deliberately designed to exclude parents from the process. And whilst in Zimbabwe we also had our own policies of racial discrimination, they didn't actually include that particular policy of excluding parents. And it's a fundamental reason why Zimbabwe's education system is recognized as being much stronger than South Africa's education system to this day, because parents are intimately involved in the education of their children. And when I speak about 39 cents per child in the last few years that government has spent, you'll appreciate that schools simply can't run on 39 cents per child. And the balance has come from parents who've dug deep and actually, even in government schools, kept those schools running. But to apply it specifically to technology, it's an impoverished society. So even parents have limited access to, certainly computers, less so to cell phones. And so my hope is that perhaps using parents' cell phones and the parents' knowledge and access to cell phones, that might provide a stepping stone to reaching out to children in future.
Matthew, can you do a brief answer?
Yeah, well, I know I'm tight on time, so I'm just going to answer one question, which is about the integration of technology and curriculum. And of course, there was also the question about experiences in doing mobiles for teacher training. So short answer to that one is that no, I've not actually done any projects using mobiles for teacher training. And I'm happy to brainstorm ideas with you if you want. But the short reason is that, well, I work in India, where I've been more blessed than Zimbabwe, in the sense that 2 to 3 years ago, in any village household that we work in those villages that we work in, well, the typical village would have at least one cell phone, maybe 2 or 3. So we don't struggle with that kind of issues that, David in Zimbabwe struggles with. Okay, integrating technology and curriculum. Oh, yeah, that was something that we spent 2 years struggling with, and we've learned so much about that. Okay, because I was a computer scientist by training who eventually figured that I'm actually doing an education project and not a technology project. So that forced me to take a lot of classes in the School of Education, and I know enough about education today comparable to a master's degree in education. And so I was the guy who actually had to bring the curriculum developers in and the technologies and all these other people. And so we conceptualize a project by thinking through what the curricular objective should be before we think about the technology. But the challenge is that, when you look at the curriculum, I mean, we try to target the government syllabus as much as we can. But the problem really is that syllabus works very well for middle-income urban children in India. But for the children in the villages, they are 3 years behind. There's no way they can learn that stuff. So we had to use the research base that we know to try to identify what are the prerequisites that they need in order to learn the curriculum that they're supposed to learn this year. And then we work backwards to determine what are the remedial curriculum, and we design a remedial curriculum for them that we build into the games.
Shane?
Okay, I'm going to just pick up one thing, cost. The question is, when are we going to, not the add-on, and when are we going to transfer? Well, I believe technology has the potential to be the holy grail. I believe it can be the silver bullet. I know everyone says, well, no, that's not going to happen, but I'm going to put 3 figures to you. In a connected environment such as, let's say, the United States, I believe that we can ensure every child learns to read, and we can do it for less than 10 cents per child. In an emerging, developing country where there is no connectivity or power, but there is a school, I believe that we can ensure a child learns to read there for $10 per child in a one-to-many situation with the devices. In a situation where there is no school and the child doesn't go to school, and that's a one-to-one situation, I believe we can do it for $100. I believe that we can solve literacy on a world level in terms of straight financial at $20 billion per year, every child there. Now, I know many will disagree. I will argue it till the cows come home on this one and show you the figures and set about proving it.
Which is a fantastically optimistic note on which to end, I think. So, for a start, thank you very much, gentlemen. And if you could all show your appreciation for their efforts this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you too for your patience and for your questions. And you now have 8 minutes for your coffee. So go and enjoy yourselves.